All right, we are just going to give it a moment and let everyone enter the session. And we will begin at 2 o'clock our time, UK. What does that make yours again, 8 a.m.?
It is 8 a.m. Yeah, well, a few minutes before, but yeah.
Yeah, 8 a.m. Sounds good.
Yeah.
It's getting very cold here. I'm not sure what it's like over there.
In Texas, it doesn't really get that cold, so it's probably 80 degrees, 75 degrees outside in the morning.
That's
Yeah,
Fahrenheit. I need to learn what
yeah.
Fahrenheit.
I'm the same way with Celsius. Every time every time I visit Europe, I'm like, what is 21? What is 21? Is that high? Is it low? Yeah, I have the exact. I have to pull out. You know, I have to pull out my phone and then do the calculation because I'm just like, okay, it, I like it colder actually when I sleep, but I don't like cold weather. The irony is not lost on me, but I don't like snow. I don't like cold weather. I don't like bundling up. I don't like any of that stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. To each their own.
Yeah, exactly. Where are you located?
Well, in London at the moment,
Right.
so we're definitely getting into cold weather here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Fine. It's all good.
Where
Okay.
in London?
West London.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Traveled the city many times, so a lot of
Yeah.
football matches.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
I said a lot of football matches. I've seen a bunch of.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. We won't get into that because that might create too much controversy.
Yes, I can imagine. Okay, so let's begin. Thank
Absolutely.
you, everyone. We are here with William Tincup to talk about how COVID has changed HR and recruiting forever. So William is president and editor at large for Recruiting Daily. And just to highlight the different topics, different discussion points for today's topic, we're going to run through how each aspect of the HR value chain needs to be configured for remote talent, including processes such as onboarding remote talent and technology such as global payroll for global remote talent. 4 key aha moments that extend beyond the hiring process, and key questions regarding remote talent to ask yourself, your team, and your leaders. So just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone's in listen-only mode, but please feel free to ask any questions using the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see a questions section in there. What we'll do is, as William's running through his session, happy to interject and ask questions as they come along rather than wait until the end. So don't hesitate, throw it out there. He'll be more than happy to answer them for you. So I'm going to hand over to William to introduce himself, and then we'll get on with the show. Thank you.
Absolutely. And will you make me presenter real quick?
Yeah, let me just do that.
Okay. And let's see here. Let's just double check. Can you see my screen?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
See, it worked out. That's crazy. First of all, welcome to everyone that's here. Thank you for giving up some of your precious time. This is a fun topic. And again, I'm going to pose a bunch of questions and hopefully some answers as well. But as you know, I love being interrupted. It's just one of those bits. I know that we'll have Q&A at the end, and I know you'll probably have questions at the end, which is fine. But also, as you have questions, please interrupt us because I just think that if something's been said and you have a question, like, well, why wait 45 minutes to get to it? So this is a topic that is kind of forced on us when we first started thinking about COVID. we all had to react, and I'm in the States. I'm in Texas, in between Dallas and Fort Worth. So it's 8 a.m. in the morning for me, and it's 2 p.m. for folks in London. Um, but what's interesting is as COVID hit, Europe kind of got hit first, right? And so y'all had to go through a lot of these things, and we were all forced, even when it hit America, we were all forced to kind of rethink work really quickly. I might add, we didn't have a whole lot of time to plan. It was, especially here in the States, it was okay. On Wednesday, everyone's not going to the office. Good luck. And for a lot of people, it just created a massive amount of chaos because they, either didn't have remote employees, they didn't know, like if you take them from a hiring perspective, they didn't know how they were going to interact with their candidates and hire. And so we'll go through a bunch of those types of things, but COVID, for better or worse, COVID kind of forced us, if you want to think of a silver lining of COVID, it forced us to rethink work. And whilst we might not like and we don't like the amount of people that have been infected or have died or families that have been impacted, we don't like any of that. It is interesting that some of these things would have probably been brought to bear eventually. And it hastened it. It sped that up, if you will. So we'll get into, topically, we're going to get into some fun things, but we're going to start with a little brevity because I always make fun of myself. It's kind of a tried and true thing in my life. Let's see. So this is a quote, direct quote, if you will, from me. And if you look at the bottom of the disclaimer, you'll see why it's funny. So I'm one of these people that, first of all, I can be very serious, and I can also be very humorous and make fun of myself or others. But I truly actually believe the quote. Okay, so let's get past the I'm making fun of myself bit. I do believe that COVID and the way that COVID has impacted businesses and especially HR and recruiting, the lasting effect of COVID, we're not even at the beginning stages of unpeeling the impact. And some of that's good, and some of that's bad, and some of it we struggle with for sure. But there's no doubt that 20 years from now we will look back at work pre-COVID, and we will look at work post-COVID, and we'll think of it like that. It's impacted our work that at its core, that substantially, if you will. I hate introductions. You notice that when Kimberly asked me to introduce myself, I bypass that mostly because I don't know. I'm just one of those people that most of my week. I'll explain it like this. Most of my week is talking to practitioners. So if you split my week, probably a 60-hour week, 30 hours or so, I'm on the phone or on email or on Zoom calls now with practitioners talking about process and technology. Sometimes collaboration and how their teams organize, but generally it's process and technology and a heavy emphasis on technology. The other half of the week is spent talking to technology vendors, like JobAdder, actually, as a great example, finding out, doing a demo, finding out what they're doing, what new features they've got going, how are they helping practitioners, and so it's a weird intersection because I get to see different vantage points. I'll talk to a global head of TA at a very large firm, and the next call will be with a sourcing play out of Spain. And so I do get questions on both sides. I like that. I love vendors and I love practitioners and I love that kind of having those conversations. So my background is riddled with working both sides of that. And so you can ask me questions on both sides. I'm pretty comfortable talking about HR or talent acquisition, if you think of sourcing now, placement, all the way across the candidate lifecycle, employee lifecycle, and alumni lifecycle. I love all of those. In fact, I haven't found a part of HR recruiting that I don't like. I'm still looking, and I might wake up one day and find one, but as of yet, I haven't found something I dislike. There's different complexities all along the value chain, and so we're going to talk about COVID and how it's impacted certain aspects of the HR and talent acquisition value chain. The value chain of HR, when we think of it, like talent acquisition has been generally thought of from sourcing all the way to onboarding. So what happens in all of those thousands of experiences along the way when we do source, we find talent, that we do a recruitment marketing, recruit, and then all of a sudden they apply to a job, and then we have all these different things that they do when they apply. We offer a job, they accept, then we onboard. I mean, I just skipped a bunch of steps in there. There's thousands of little bitty micro experiences or micro steps, if you will. And then that starts their employee journey, which again, I've pulled out probably 6 different things of their employee journey, and as it relates to remote work, because that's what we wanted to talk about. But there's many more. Like we could have really, literally, probably have spent a whole day talking about just talent management and how COVID has impacted talent management. Um, but we wanted to go broader. We purposely wanted to kind of just think about how COVID has impacted with remote work. How has it impacted the business of both talent acquisition and HR? So you can ask more questions that are off of this list. I'm totally comfortable with that. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer, and it might spur on me to then go and do some research, which is one of the reasons I do webinars like this, is to learn. And so Kimberly asked you to ask questions, and please do. As we go through this, I would appreciate it. It'll make us smarter. It'll also make all of our peers that listen to this and experience this smarter as well. So I put out Twitter IDs, both with Job Adder and myself. If you like tweeting, if that's your bit, there you go. They'll be on every page, so you'll be able to find them. And at the end of the presentation is all my contact information, so you don't have to worry about like how you're going to find me afterwards. I'm pretty easy to be found, and so if you have questions that maybe you don't want to ask publicly for whatever reason, which sometimes I find is because of what company they work for. Sometimes practitioners work for a company, a defense contractor, let's say, and they can't ask the question publicly because they just can't disclose, and so they'll reach out to me afterwards. That's totally fine. You'll have more contact information for me than you ever will need. So let's get started. I wanted to start by kind of making it human in this process that we're about to go through, and talk about one person and model a person, and then model it through the life cycle. And this person is Lori. So a couple things about Lori that are going to be important as we go through the journey. Lori's a software engineer, and she's been doing that for a long time, right? She holds degrees in computer science. So she's worked in application development. She lives and works in Austin, Texas, which, by the way, is about 2.5 hours from my house. It's pretty much right in the middle of America. So not West Coast or East Coast, like literally right in the middle. And she's thinking about a change, but she's not out on, Indeed or hitting people's careers websites and things like that, right? So that's kind of her background. And I use the word new gig just because I've learned that here in the States, people under 30 don't say jobs. It's kind of a weird phenomena, and I like it. And it is changing the vernacular or the lexicon for the way we think of careers and work. Is younger people, most of millennials and all of Gen Z, they don't say work, they don't say career path, they don't say jobs. They think of things from gigs. And so I purposely put that in there because Lori is not actively looking for a new gig, but a new gig might find her. And so without any further ado, we'll get into the value chain. Okay. So again, aspects, it's purposely said aspects and not the entire value chain for everything that I just mentioned, because I don't want to try and represent every potential aspect of the value chain of HR. It would take us too long to go through those things. So let's start with talent acquisition. So with remote work, so when you think about remote work and you think about location, Lori now, she works in Austin, or she lives in Austin, Texas, as a backdrop. But now Lori's, because of remote work, because of COVID pushed us to think of remote work differently because we all had to go home and work from home. And there's obviously a lot of pluses and minuses to that, right? So you're now at home. There's some freedom that comes with that. There's less of a commute. Your family, if you're married or whatever, you have husband, spouse, partner, your uncles, your grandmother, kids, all of that. So there's again pluses and minuses to remote work. We won't belabor that. Y'all have lived that yourself, so you can kind of figure that out. But where this changes the application process or the search for a job, Lori would have looked historically for jobs in Austin, Texas, because she lives there. So she would have, basically put in Austin, comma, applications developer, comma, Austin, Texas, 12, whatever bit she wants to do. And she would have looked at it, it was location based. And so it was tethered. Her job would have been tethered because she would have either gone into the office every day or periodically or been expected to or whatever. But with remote work, her aperture for how she can look for a job is now the aperture of the world. So she can get a job in Paris as long as she's comfortable with the time zones and the time change. There's no difference if someone's working in Paris for a Parisian company and someone that's working from Austin, Texas. So remote work has destroyed this idea that you have to be in the place. That's a fundamental change. And again, whether or not we go back to everyone in the office or whether or not we go all the way to remote work, I think it's going to be more of a hybrid. I think we all are thinking about it as a hybrid and more of a choice. But the one thing I want to make sure that you understand is that it just has opened up that aperture. Like prior to this, if I wanted to get a job in London, I would have been considering, okay, the move to London and my family relocating and finding a place and all that stuff. With remote work, all that's out the window. The flip side is also true. So sourcers, folks that find talent, right? They have been tethered to location as well. They've had to, tried to find people that are either in those areas or would relocate to those areas. And now that that's not necessarily a part of the criteria, and again, we're probably mostly thinking about, jobs that could be done remotely, right? So if you separate in your mind the work that can be done, like if you're a cash register person or a bank teller, remote work probably isn't impacting you as much as it is someone that works, as a computer programmer. So we are, in this presentation at least, we're thinking more about those folks. So sourcers would have been tethered and have been historically tethered to a place, or whether or not someone can come to that place. And now their aperture, so Lori's aperture for a hunt for a new job, and the sourcers and recruiters aperture are both now open. Now that's good and bad, right? So the good part is now you can look for a job all over the world. The good news there is also is that you can do that. The bad news, I guess, is that everyone else can do that too. Same thing with sourcing. Sourcing is also their aperture is opened, and so is every other sourcer's aperture. So it's going to increase your candidate flow from the idea of where you can get candidates, but also everyone else is doing the same thing. So competition's still there. Like it hasn't decreased competition. All it has done is, I say all, one of the things that it's done is just open up the opportunities on both sides. So third thing is Indeed released a study, I believe it was about 2 months ago now, and it was actually about remote work. And it was talking about job descriptions and job adverts that use the word remote work in the job description and why that's important. And also whether or not that job would be remote work forever or remote work during COVID, because candidates ask that question when they first get into the company or to apply to the company. They ask the question of, okay, this is a remote work. I see that I can work from Austin, Texas, in Lori's case. Will I always be able to work remotely? Will I always be able to? So in your job descriptions and in your job ads, not only do you, if it is a remote work position, not only do you need to state that, but you also need to clarify that this is a remote work position. Once COVID is done, we expect that there's going to be some flexibility as to whether or not this is remote work for the future, or whether or not you're in the office once a month, something like that. You've got to make some type of you've got to first of all make clear whether or not it's remote work or not. The job ad will produce better if it is remote work, because that's the most searched phrase on Indeed. So, but again, I don't want you to game that in a way. If it is remote work, great. If it isn't, that's great too. But if it is, there's also going to be some clarifying questions that candidates ask you about that. I think one of the things that I wondered about this, and I've wondered about this since video interviewing first started about 2008, 2009, is what type of bias do we have against video interviewing? Like, there's so many people that just love to go to the interview, candidates, and they love going to the office, do a tour, meet people, shake hands, do all that bit. And there's also on the other side, hiring managers and recruiters that like that too. And when we all had to go to home to work, hiring from home, it is, obviously we've done it for months now, so I guess we've gotten better at it. But it also it proved to me that those biases that I thought were there, we got over them pretty quickly if they were there. I know I've talked to tons of recruiters and candidates that, doing now a Zoom call and as an interview, not a problem. Like recruiters, hiring managers, sourcers, candidates, whilst it might have been an issue at one point, not a problem right now. Not as of November. People are comfortable on video. They're comfortable on Zoom or GoToWebinar or Skype or something like that, and being able to talk. So I think that's interesting, and I also think that might be here to stay, or it might be a choice as it relates to, hey, you want to come into the office? Like if you live in the city, if you live in Austin, you want to come to the office? Great. If you don't, let's do it through Zoom. Which wasn't there in December. That wasn't how we talked. The last point is about how we do, because now that aperture is open, and thinking about Lori taking a job in London, if you will. Okay, how do we find out how do we, you're going to go into assessing and skills testing and do a bunch of other things, but also how do we just do simple background checks and background screenings and reference checking in the ways that we can within the laws of where we are, but also just to find more about the candidate, again, within the laws, but finding out more about the candidate. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be really interesting is because it's going to push us all to think more globally about talent, which we probably should have been doing for for a while now. But remote work is, again, COVID has pushed us into this place of thinking about, purposely thinking about it more, which is nice.
Hmm.
Kimberly, you got anything before I go to the next slide?
Yeah. No, I have a question around that whole reference checking part.
Right,
How would you know whether it's a case of finding a service like Extra, for example, that you
right.
can go through, or if you don't have access to a tool like that, how would you know which reference checking options are worth using, depending on the country? Like, does each country have a specific
Right.
um,
Well,
view?
now you become an expert in both recruiting in your country and reference checking in your country, right? So if you're in England, what does reference checking look like in England? What can and can't you do? But if you're hiring someone in Austin as a remote worker, the laws of where they live apply.
Mm,
So it's not just your laws and what you can and can't do, but it's also what can and can't be done there. And that's really interesting for American companies. I can tell you because because of GDPR and the way that y'all think of data, which is actually I think the best in the world. I think it actually forces American companies not just to comply with GDPR, but to start thinking about GDPR as it relates to hiring and what can and can't they do and can and can't say and how data is stored and all these types of things, which is wonderful. But yeah, it's the tools are now open where
mm,
you look at tools both in your location and you look at tools and where they're located and what you can and can't do. So
mm,
it's bifurcated now, which is it sounds complex, but a lot of the larger, let's say take HireRight as a background screening company, a lot of those folks are global.
mm,
So it's as easy as, clicking a box and saying where the candidate's coming from. They've already sorted for what you can and can't do and questions you can and can't ask. So you're probably working with more global players, which is a great thing because they've already got it sorted and you don't have to think about it.
exactly.
but but yeah, you're looking at it. You're bifurcating the laws of your land and then the laws of their land and what you can and can't do. And
Mm,
again, that's a complexity that we might not have, considered pre-COVID. And now we will because we want that remote work. We want that aperture because it increases our talent base. Instead of only having, you know, 5,000 lorries in Austin, Texas, well, now we've got access to millions of lorries all over the world. So the good news is we have access to more talent. The bad news is we have access to more talent, and it creates a complexity. So no doubt, no doubt. Um, so top line here is how do remote workers and remote work candidates how do they change the way we recruit? So if we think of our recruiting process in December and we say to ourselves, what's the recruitment process now? Thinking about that globally, thinking about how location, we've been tethered for years, tethered to a location, and now we don't have to be. Okay, what does that look like? Secondly, when we get to job adverts, job descriptions, and how we think of those, and again, thinking about that location, if we were just looking for, software engineers or application developers in London, well, we would have probably written that job ad in, proper English. And we probably wouldn't have thought much about that at all. I would say now, because you are looking at global talent, putting that job ad in multiple languages and having the ability to put it in multiple languages. Again, you're going after global talent, and why not put that in the languages of the candidates that you'd like to recruit? And again, that sounds complex, but there's tools that do that. So you don't have to, you know, Google Translate. I mean, it gets you 80% there. It's not going to be perfect, but at the same time, it's just there's a complexity. There's also ways to solve for it, but just thinking about job ads now being in 20 or 30 languages, and because y'all are in Europe, this is kind of natural for y'all. I don't think there's much of a change. I think really this impacts, probably countries that are a little bit more insular, America being one of them. We tend to think of the four walls of the U.S. So I think this really impacts us trying to recruit talent. Australia is a little bit like that as well, but because of proximity to all of Europe, I think y'all are a little bit. This is not going to be, this is not going to be a shock to you. The assessment tools, when you look at assessment tools, again, finding tools that are culturally both relevant and also don't bring in the bias is going to be important. So you're going to be looking at skills testing and language testing and behavioral and personality and all these different things, but you want tests that also has cultural appropriateness to them. So applying a personality test that's, let's say, English based, for people that are English based, well, that works when just your talent is English. But if your talent is now global, now you have to rethink that. And again, these aren't bad things, not at all. These are things that we would have eventually gotten to, but COVID pushed us here, which I think is fantastic. Skills testing, I think, again, technical skills, because it's ones and zeros, it's a little bit different. The only thing is kind of some of the narration around code that becomes a little bit interesting, but skills testing, if you're testing for something else that's maybe not technical, then they need to be multilingual, multicultural, multiracial. They need to be thinking about, again, that larger aperture of talent.
Before you go on, William, I've
Sure.
got a question from Stuart. Stuart asks,
Hey, Stuart.
should screens include a candidate's ability to an assessment of the environment for working from home?
Oh, that's a great question, Stuart. Oh my gosh. Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, it's not just one wonderful question. It's not just the ability for Lori to do the job in Austin, Texas, but also what is Lori's setup? What can she be? Can she be both productive and effective, and not just competent and do the job? So how do you assess for that? To date, I haven't found great assessments. I'm sure they're being developed as we speak around what makes a remote worker thrive. Like, just because you want to work from home post-COVID doesn't mean necessarily that you're great at working from home. And I think we're going to find some assessments on the front end that assess for people that thrive in a remote work environment and people that don't. I can tell you that some of that, let's say post-COVID, the rush back to the office, some of that might be personality, introverts versus extroverts. Some of it might be if you have, 3 children under the age of 5, you might be looking forward to getting back to the office. Not that you don't love your kids, but you might just be really ready to get back to the office. So it's not going to be as easy as that. But Stuart, I love where your mind is around assessing for not just the talent and the skills and the competencies of doing the job, but also that environment, because we controlled that environment in December. The office, we controlled that environment. And now that we don't necessarily or can't control that, we need to assess for that. We need to, at least probatively, if it isn't an assessment, it's probably a battery of questions that we ask candidates, like, hey, tell us a little bit about your work, your office. Like, what's that like? Just explain to us kind of what your setup is and how you're going to be successful, how you've been successful up to now. So it might not be kind of your assessment from an IO psychology perspective, but asking those questions of candidates, Stuart, I think is a really, really smart idea, because it's, again, we want to make sure you're going to be successful. You want to be successful, so let's talk a little bit about that. What's your setup? Really, really good question, which leads us to onboarding. So onboarding before, this was you had a little cubicle and you got a box and there was some stuff in it and business cards and there was a computer. Onboarding was, some of it was compliance, some of it was a checklist, meet your mentor, all of that type stuff. Okay, Lori's in Austin, company's in England. How do you do that? How do you actually successfully onboard remote workers? And you want them to feel, again, you want them to feel part of that team, part of that culture. So how do they meet everybody on their team? How do we train Lori to use, I have it as employee self-service, but how do we get them to use our systems? It's probably a better way of thinking about it. What do we use collaboration software? Is it Slack, project management software, Monday? Like, what do we use and how do we get her trained? Again, in an office, you can just go down to the training room and pull up the screen and train. When Lori's in Austin and the company's in London, you can't go down to the conference room. So how do we do that? The second to last bullet point is something that maybe we haven't been great at, but something that we probably should get great at is learning what Lori needs to learn. I think you can do this as a candidate. When you're actually still recruiting, Lori is finding out, what do you want to learn? Like, what do you want to grow? What skills do you want to get better at? Great. During onboarding, it's validating that or revalidating that. You said you wanted to learn Java. Okay. And then putting them on a pathway to learn that. Again, it's a remote employee. It's not as easy as being able to stop by their office, stop by their cubicle, or stop by and talk to them about this. And so how do we find out what skills they want to learn and then put them on some type of path? Why this is important, not just for remote workers, is this is what candidates care about. So candidates coming into your company, they care about what's next, like internal mobility. They care about how you're going to train them, how you're going to make them better, just training and development or learning and development, and how are you going to praise them, which is rewards and recognition. So remote workers aren't any different. They're still going to want those things, and especially folks that are under the age of 30, they're going to ask those questions. And so even though Lori lives in Austin, still got to be able to answer the question. Stuart, this last bullet point kind of gets to what you're hinting at, not as an assessment, but more as, as an onboarding, what do we need to ship her? Okay, is it a laptop? Is it a webcam? Is it setting up lighting and a mic? Like, what is it that we have to do to set up Lori to be successful? Because that's what we would do with employees that came to the office. So it's just a complexity that we have to think about. Like, okay, Lori might not ever come to the office. Okay, we can still ensure that Lori is successful and that we're successful. So
Go
ahead.
Go on. Stuart says thank you. He says that leads to the next question of what can organizations do to influence the remote working environment?
Great question. Well, first of all, I think this is some of this gets sorted before they're employees, right? So these are questions that you ask in the recruiting process. Not only what are the setups, what do you have, what do you need, but what's going to make you successful? And that's from a company perspective and understanding, here's what all of our application developers, this is what they do and this is what they use their setup. Do you have that setup? Are you comfortable with that? If not, you're also still recruiting, so this is a good way to screen in and screen out. But if you've moved forward offer letter and they've onboarded now, Now it's a game of just making sure that they get what they need. And then I don't think it's just you ask a battery of questions and then you fulfill on it. I think it's checkpoints, as we would do it with location-based employees. You would ask these questions. You would stop in a first week, second week, 10 days in. You'd check, how are you doing? Do you need anything? Is there anything else we can do to make you, set you up for success? We've been asking those questions in HR for hundreds of years. Like, that's not new. What's new is not being able to see Lori and not being able to have Lori in the same room. And so I think Stuart, I think the question is, you're going to do the touch points that you've done historically, but you're probably going to amp them up and talk to Lori more frequently about her success. What's enabling her success? So on the positive side, like what's working, and what's disabling, like what's in the way. We want to make sure that you're productive and you're happy. And so what do we need to do to get you to that place? And that's a never ending, that's not a destination, that's a journey. And I think that's a journey with location-based employees too. So it's going to change the way we do things a little bit, but we're still going to do the same things. So
Thank you.
yeah, no worries. With the rest of performance, I think the way you think of performance is, how do we do performance reviews in whatever way that we do them? How do we do them location-based? And then how does that translate to how we do that with remote workers, remote employees? How do we do feedback? How does Lori give feedback to us? So we look at this and we start thinking of feedback 360, and how do we give Lori the feedback that she needs to be better at the job? And how does Lori give us the feedback so that we can be better at our jobs as peers, managers, etc. So that's bidirectional. With an outcomes-based environment, how do we do goal setting? Again, I think what's interesting about remote work and with knowledge workers in particular is we get away from the how of work. How you do it, because in an office it's easy to get into the how, but when someone's in Austin, Texas, and you're in London, you're kind of out of the how, and it really does kind of put more of an emphasis on the outcome, which is great, because now you can get away from how and you can just talk about, okay, what are the goals? What are the outcomes? How do we reach the outcomes? Which I think, well, again, with knowledge workers, not bank tellers, I think is a great way to work. We get ourselves out of that. So I think remote work is actually forcing us to be better about just being goal oriented and outcomes based. The last bullet point is kind of interesting, and this is going to be not a little controversial, but again, Lori's in Austin and you're in England. Do you, like, this wouldn't have been something that we would have normally done if we went to the conference room B, but do we record that? Do we record our Zoom call? Do we record that so that we can go back to it and review that together the next time we do a performance review? And again, there's laws in place, so we're not going to do anything that's illegal, but it's conceptually, what do we do that could be different in the future about how we actually manage the conversation that happened? Because it's an important conversation. I mean, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, whatever your bid is, how often or frequent you give them, it is good to kind of go back to those things and say, hey, last time we talked, this is what we talked about. Let's look at the video. Okay, so what's changed? What's made you better? What are we doing to kind of get in the way? How do we help? All that stuff that you do in performance. And so you might think of that differently with remote workers. You might not. You might do the exact same process, but you just might think of it differently. And some of that might be tethered to a location, and some of it might not be.
Before you, William,
Yeah, sure.
From Debbie. Hi, Debbie. Debbie asks, what do you find is the most effective means of measuring onboarding success with a remote workforce?
Huh. Productivity. Great question, Debbie. How fast can you get them to be productive? So you're onboarding and pre-boarding, which is a concept that I think it's not new because of COVID, but it is something that a lot of companies have moved to, is after the offer letter has been signed and accepted, that a flurry of activities happen before they even start. Pre-boarding stuff like, signing the sexual harassment policy or the data privacy policy or whatever the policies that you have, getting all that compliance stuff done before they even start work. But how fast, and Debbie, this is one way to measure is speed. The other is going to be quality. But how fast can you get them to a place where they feel like they can be successful and where they feel like they can be productive? So the speed, velocity is going to be one, and then quality. You don't want them to just be getting fast into work. You also want them to be doing quality outcomes. And so I think it's a combination of both those things that give you a measurement of how well your onboarding is going. And things that need to change. I think there's these great questions. Every time you onboard a new employee is a wonderful opportunity to ask them what needs to change. Like, how can we make this better? And again, that's 30, 60, 90, 180 days into the process. Like, what could we do to make that faster? And again, getting both speed, and velocity and quality. And how do we do that? They'll tell you. They'll give you tips if you ask them. I would wish you would have sent me my laptop 1 week earlier, so that I could have gotten on and kind of taken around and downloaded things and kind of got it set up instead of the week of. Oh, okay. That's easy to fix. We'll send we'll send laptops a week earlier. But definitely checkpoints and asking that get you some of that data. But that's a great question, Debbie. Thank you so much. As we think of global payroll and benefits, okay, again, Austin, Texas, you'll be looking at different providers because you'll have your provider in England that helps you there, but you'll also now need to think about services and benefits and payroll and how you're going to then get that person paid and all that type of stuff. It's really not that hard. It sounds difficult, but what it does is it pushes you into global payroll and global benefits, global services, and there's tons of providers out there. So, but it is a change. You'll have kind of your system of record that's for the folks in England, and then you'll also have another system that works with employees that you have all around the world. Sometimes those are the same, by the way. Sometimes you can use one system that does both, or you can use two different systems. It doesn't matter. It just changes the complexity. But I think that complexity actually is good for us because it gives us access to all of this new talent that we weren't thinking about or couldn't get to. And because COVID pushed us to remote work, especially with knowledge workers, it's a worthy pursuit for us. Okay, so we want them to have the kind of the same or some type of equality and access to the services that we have for our folks in London. And we want to be able to provide that for Lori, who's in Austin, Texas. The second to the last bullet point is controversial, and we won't go through it, but I want you to think about this. Most of compensation historically has been location-based, cost of living, right?
Mm.
So if you live in, let's say, Leeds versus, London, let's just say an expensive part of London, if you will. Okay, there would be historically a location-based or cost of living adjustment to your pay. So let's say it's a $300,000 job. And what's interesting about where this might take us is that's a $300,000 job in London, but in Leeds, or Brighton, or pick your favorite, smaller city other than London, that's not a $300,000 job. That's a $150,000 job. Well, the interesting part of that is that's created inequities, pay inequities in our organizations. We've justified that because someone lives in London versus leads. But at the end of the day, that's a job. If you choose to live in London, that's your choice. And again, with remote work, I think there's going to be a reckoning about this that's going to come to bear on why we use location or why we use cost of living as an adjustment. If it's a job, there's an outcome that's finite. So whether or not you live in Tokyo or Austin, Texas, or Topeka, Kansas, it doesn't matter, it's an outcome. So why are we paying more or less for that? And why are we creating inequities inside of our company? Again, relatively controversial, and I don't have a great answer for it because I don't think people are thinking about it as much as we are right now. And again, COVID pushed us into this conversation, which is fantastic because I think it'll force us to then think more about what are we paying for? Is it the job or where they live? Or is it a job and where they live? Anyhow. So workforce planning, how do we think of succession? How do we think of workforce planning? How do we plan for the future when the future then dictates that half of our workforce is now going to be remote? Okay, like that's okay. But how do we now do that when in December all of our employees were in London? And so we could think of workforce planning in a different way. And so now there's a complexity to that that's interesting. And again, I think we would have been pushed there anyhow. So let me go through learning really quickly. It's again, how do we grow? This goes back to onboarding, goes back to pre-boarding, goes back to the candidate. How do we know what Lori wants to learn? How do we grow Lori's skills? How do we invest in that? How do we do that even though she's in Austin, Texas? What type of LMS do we use? What type of content do we put in front of it? Is it just job-related content, or is it content that Lori wants to learn as well? All these are wonderful questions. How do we activate her in our LMS and with content, training content, learning content? I'm not just dealing with the compliance-related stuff. I'm really thinking outside of compliance and thinking about like skills and things that Lori wants to learn and things that we want Lori to learn. So there's a company kind of directive, like companies want their employees, remote or otherwise, to learn things, and employees want to learn things, and a lot of that a lot of that overlaps, but some of it doesn't. And how do we activate that? I think the last bullet point: will we set them up to learn in the same way? So learning, kind of traditional training, we go to the conference room, we all sit in rows, we all get out our laptops and somebody trains us on some bit. Or we log into a webinar and we learn a bit. Is that different? Is it fundamentally different, or is it nuanced? But what's different about training and learning as it relates to remote workers?
Sorry,
So,
one second, William,
sure.
you're frozen. I'm not sure why. We can
Oh,
hear
okay.
you, but your screen is stuck.
Well, you know what? I hope it has a really good picture of me. But but
We'll
I'll
continue.
just keep talking. It'll come back. It'll come back. See, again, yet another reason to think about remote work. Camera's freezing. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about this, the compensation package for Lori, the similarities or differences, and how we think of that. Do we think about inequities as we've talked about? Do we think about those differently? Do we think about location differently? Do we shut down the London office and everyone work from home and meet once or twice a year at a place? These are questions that COVID pushed us to think about, but I think people were already on the path to thinking about this anyhow. I think performance and outcomes based, again, with knowledge workers, not bank tellers. How do you do performance and how do you do your outcomes based pay is really interesting. And I think when you look at comp professionals, again, how do their job got more interesting because of COVID, because of that aperture, all the positive things that I talked about in talent acquisition, that aperture, being open for both employer and candidate. it's all great in talent acquisition, but once you get into compensation, their complexity just went up tenfold. Because now they have to figure out compensation in Texas or United States, in Texas, in Central Texas, in Austin, and figure out what comp looks like there. How does it relate? How do they create parity in compensation? No easy answers, by the way, for compensation professionals, unfortunately. Succession is, we've thought of success. First of all, no one does succession really, really well. So let's just kind of all hit pause. No one's ever really done this like masterfully. Some companies do it better than others, but by and large, we don't do succession all that well. But one of the things that COVID has kind of unraveled is most of our succession plan has been location based. Someone, the person that we want to replace the person in London lives in Manchester. That's fantastic. How are we going to relocate them to London? And how are they then going to take that job and then do the job for the next 10 years or whatever? Well, that's all thrown out the window when your employees are a part of your remote employees that you want to have on your succession plan are now remote. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something to think about. How do you think of succession differently with remote employees? And how do you think of them? How do you get outside the office? How do you get outside of the politics of the office and think about people that you want in your succession plan? And the second thing about a mentor, I think these are really important things. And again, your mentor, Lori's mentor, can be, in Dubai. None of that matters. It's how do you plug in and how do you connect mentee and mentor? And again, in an office environment, it's really easy. Ashley, this is Rick. Rick, this is Ashley. Y'all get to know each other. Fantastic. You're a mentor, you're a mentee. Have a nice day. Now that's not as easy because of remote work, still needs to be done. We just need to rethink how we're doing it. And again, career progression, gigs from Lori's perspective is how do I go from one gig to the next gig to the next gig to the next gig, all within your company. And that's internal mobility. Well, how do we help her with that? What do we do to assess that growth? Last important slide, I would say, is these are the aha moments. This is the things that I really want you to kind of think about. What does employee engagement look like? Employee engagement, at least historically, December, let's say pre-December, was food being delivered to the office. It was ping pong tables. It was everyone going out for a pint. Whatever that was. There was an engagement level. There was culture, and we defined all of those things based on kind of activities that were in and around the office. When you're 50% of your workforce, your knowledge workers are remote, how does that change? How does employee engagement change? How does culture change? What do we do? What is our culture? I think a lot of companies are asking that question right now is, what is our culture? Which leads to the third thing. How have your values changed? How has COVID and remote work impacted your values? Or has it? And I think I would start with the assumption that it has, and then prove yourself that it hasn't, rather than doing the opposite. And then the last point on the aha moment is how do you retain? So again, Lori's in Austin, Texas. You've been working together for a month, 2 months, 9 months, a year. You really like her work. She really likes working for the company and the team. How do you retain her? Like programmatically, what do you do? Process-wise, what do you do? Philosophically, how do you go about retention of your top employees, and of which some, if not all, will be remote workers? So how do you reconfigure retention in your mind to then get to the goals of actually retaining your best talent, which is kind of the game, right? It's how do we retain this talent? We worked really hard to get them there. We've done all these things to make sure they're successful. How do we retain them? And so this slide in particular is something that's going to keep you up at night to some degree if you do it well. We've been doing some questions along the way, so we won't spend that too much time there. This is all my contact information on the left. And again, I'm totally comfortable with folks emailing me or texting me or whatever if they have questions. And so that's it. And I know we're at or around time, so I apologize. But I like the questions I like Stuart's and Debbie's questions during the presentation, so it's okay.
Well, thank you so much, William.
Sure.
Let's try and stop that presentation and see if that might unfreeze you.
Sure.
Where are we? Bear with me.
Let's see.
It did.
What? Why did it freeze? I have no idea. I'm so sorry. And sorry to the audience. I hope it froze me like
Yeah,
I was a
mime. Appropriate.
Exactly.
No, thank you so much. Again, if anyone has any questions for William, you can find him across various platforms, from LinkedIn to Twitter to email. So please do reach out. He's very approachable, as we've seen.
100%.
William, thank you so much for your time and your insights.
This was fun. Thank you so much for asking, by the way. I really appreciate it.
No, we appreciate your all your efforts with this. Thank you. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you got a lot out of this. This is recorded, so you will be receiving a recorded version in the next day or so. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Take care. Enjoy your day wherever you are in the world. And we'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much, William.
Absolutely. Take care and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.